I'm going to take it from a position that some of you might be familiar with the sound of the pedal steel, but you possibly haven't seen it, in the wild, as it were. There's a story I was told by a fellow steel player called Tom. He was playing with a singer-songwriter called Martin, and at the end of this gig they were playing in Brixton, Martin, was approached by a really drunk Irish guy, and he said, "Oh God, oh, the set was beautiful. Oh, it was just fantastic. Oh, and your friend in the wheelchair. Oh, oh, he plays a mean piano." So that's kind of my getting off point for this talk. So there's going to be a little bit of history, a little bit of autobiography, a little bit of postulating, and a little bit of music as well. So what I'm going to start with is just talking briefly about the history of the pedal steel. So the pedal steel, this thing you see before you, like all of the steel instruments, draws its history from Hawaii. Now, when a lot of Spanish and Mexican sailors came through Hawaii, they did what they did in other bits of the world, which is they dropped off guitars. And the thing which Hawaiian natives did, which everybody else in the world did with these Spanish guitars, was the first thing they did is they took it out of that Spanish tuning. You remember when you were learning guitar, it was E minor and C and G, and this was all, it was pretty complicated, and without anyone to teach it, what they did is they tuned it open, which means when you strum all the strings, it presents a more kind of mellifluous sound than that more complex sound, which is associated with flamenco. And this worked really well, and in fact it worked even better when they put a bar under the strings to raise them off. And if you look at this, you can actually see that the strings are not against the fret like they are on a guitar, they're raised up by a higher nut. And then they added the use of the bar, which is where it gets its name, the steel. This is a steel bar. I've actually just put one of my lightest sort of secondary ones over here, and I thought maybe you could just get it going around. So it's just on the table over there, and if you want to just take it and sort of pass it on. This one's a little bit posher, significantly heavier. And so this style of tuning worked pretty well with Hawaiian music, and then the steel took off in popularity and started to be exported to the American mainland. And it was there that the problems really started, which was that pedal steel was starting to be adapted into music like Western swing, which was a mixture of jazz and blues and country. And with that came more complicated harmonies and more complicated chords, because what was being used in Hawaii was that kind of sort of open major chord, got something called a major sixth in it. Very nice, but it wasn't going to cut it because there were lots of different kinds of chords in Western swing. There's 7 chords, there's minor chords, there's complicated chords, there's these sorts of chords. Well, there's sort of, But anyway, so this is a problem because the pedal steel really, you're playing it with one finger, as it were. So let's say you've got a tune like this. That's your tuning, and you can play, if you're doing a doo-wop tune, it'd be... But where do you get your minor chord from? You can sort of fudge it out of this, but it's a bit complicated. You're limited by what you can do. So people thought the obvious thing to do was to have one neck for Hawaiian and then one neck for country. And so what they did is they created a pedal steel. Well, it wasn't a pedal steel, it was called a console steel then. They created it with an extra neck. And then suddenly jazz comes along and they want to play jazz. So it seems to me pretty obvious what they needed to do, which is they added an extra neck, and then there's rock and roll and blues. And things start to get really silly, right? Because this is a logistical nightmare, as well as it being incredibly heavy and a real strain on the pedal steel, on the steel players. It's also, costly, and you can't damp all those strings. If the drummer hits a cymbal, suddenly all the strings are vibrating. It's a big issue. What they needed is what we all need in our life, which is a modular solution, which is one neck that can play all the chords. All that sort of stuff. And so it was in the 50s that out of the Nashville steel players came the pedal steel. I'll explain more what's actually going on with the pedal steel, but I just want to kind of show some of the early history. So there were a lot of originators, but one of them, probably the most significant one, is Buddy Emmons, the greatest steel player who ever lived, possibly also the greatest hat wearer who ever lived. He had a degree of significant influence on the pedal steel, and he also had a significant influence on the hat-wearing scene of Nashville at the time. This is a clip of him playing with Ernest Tubb. Well, you can hear what's going on in that sound is, as well as the kind of, all that stuff, from the earlier times of console steel, there's also this kind of, which is at that time pretty basic, but this is pedal steel. So what's going on? I'm going to take it from here that your chord theory knowledge is pretty good, right? So I'm going to, if not expert. But anyway, so what I'll explain is, if you looked underneath the pedal steel, what you'd find is an enormous amount of kind of bell cranks and rods and levers. This is a pure physics engineering project. There's nothing fancy going on. What there is 3 pedals down here and 5 knee levers. This is not the same for all steels. I also have 12 strings. 10 is more typical. I use 12 because it gives me a fuller range. And each tuning is kind of unique. But in principle, this is what's happening. Let's take that open chord, which we were talking about before, and this is a C chord, so it's got the notes C, E, and G in it, in no particular order, right? And I'm going to depress one of these pedals, and what that's going to do is it's going to pull one of the notes. Did you hear that? Went up. So now it's become this, which is nice, kind of churchy, right? So I've got my major chord, and now I'm going to add another pedal. Through the magic of harmony, it's gone from here and that's what's going on with the pedal steel. You're adjusting incrementally small little modular bits of the tuning in order to turn it into whole different chords, and that's why you're able to take and turn it into something a lot more complicated, like a bit of Debussy, which I'm going to play a bit later. So let's talk about actually how on earth do you get into this instrument. Well, I was between jobs and I wanted to learn a new instrument. I spent many years on the guitar, and you can't buy a pedal steel online. You can't buy it in shops. You can't buy it fucking anywhere. What you do is you go onto this forum. This is the forum I took that a few weeks ago, that screenshot, not 12 or 13 years ago, as you might imagine. That's the British Steelies forum. This is where you buy your steels. And then you get in touch with someone who has a steel, and then you sell everything you own. And you take a journey into the home counties to a bungalow with a man who pulls a steel out of his bed and sells it to you for £1,500. And it's not always good quality because it's been around since the 70s. And it's a hand-me-down, and he's a real scoundrel, this guy, John. And tuition's not very good either, not least because the people who are, putting up videos of tuition are shut-ins from the home counties, so it was always very hard to actually learn the steel once you got it, and I didn't want to learn Old Brown Jug, I felt I'd moved on from that as a musician. Thanks God, I actually ran into BJ Cole. BJ Cole has actually played this place so many times, he's actually played in a couple of weeks. He was a very successful session player in the 70s and 80s. He played on Time Dancer by Elton John. More recently, he plays a lot of classical music. Thought I'd just play a little clip of what he does. It's proper, isn't it? I go up to BJ's about twice a year and steal every idea that isn't nailed down, and he is a true Muswell hillbilly. Like most country musicians from the 70s and 80s, he tries to stay as close to Crouch End as humanly possible. So I take the trip up from Brighton up to Southgate. So anyway, once I was a very experienced musician going into this, and there were still considerable barriers to entry. There's the high price, there's the lack of tuition, there's the actual difficulty of buying it. I'm actually going to turn around to see this one. Oh yeah, you've got to maintain the thing, and if it's not in good condition in the first place, I actually eventually took the plunge and got a first-hand one, which was really hard to buy. really hard to play. Had to get from Minnesota. And then there's the lack of diverse player base, because most players are country players, you know, and they're getting older as well. So once you've got that, you've got an instrument, though lovely, is enormously underexplored and actually really difficult to get into. So now I kind of just want to talk about the future. A lot of people are obsessed with what the future of the pedal steel is, not least actually pedal steelers themselves. They're very, very worried about it all of the time, which is strange because they never seem to actually do anything about it. They just sort of talk about it. And what this really comes back to is Buddy Emmons, the hat-wearing gentleman I mentioned earlier, because of course pedal steel was pioneered inside of country music mechanically, but then the problem was that it kind of got stuck musically inside of country music, and of course that's where we know it from, all that sort of thing. And country music is not a good place to be if you want to be part of a musically innovative genre, you know, it just hasn't changed that much. And there are, you know, some modern bands who are bringing steel back. The most well-known one is Steelism, who explore it in a decidedly kind of retro way, you know. But I think if we're kind of looking to what the potential of the steel is, and I do feel like I need to put my money where my mouth is, I think we want to look perhaps to actually just more basically the architecture of this thing, which is, what do we have? We've got an instrument of almost infinite sustain, courtesy of this volume pedal. Please, if someone can ask a question on the volume pedal later, that'd be very useful. It takes well to effect. It's incredibly expressive, and sometimes I do wonder why pedal steelers want to play country music when they can go what I call full Blue Planet, which is this sort of thing, you know. Do that for days at a time sometimes. What it really reminds me of is like, you know, is the synthesizer, right? Which is, you know, the pedal steel clearly has something in common with, you know, it's a very analog version of the synthesizer, you know. And this is kind of, you know, I talk at the end of the talk very briefly about one of my recent musical heroes, which is a woman called, anyone got this one? Hip audience? Suzanne Chaney. Suzanne Chaney, so she was a synth pioneer in the 70s. She actually did a lot of music for like Coke jingles and stuff like that in the 80s, the pop and pour thing. But anyway, she kind of was involved in taking the synth away from kind of men in lab coats and this rather austere thing, and kind of humanizing it a lot and bringing it out and kind of making it more mainstream and accessible. And that's kind of my kind of little hypothesis is that actually steel is quite a mainstream instrument. It just hasn't necessarily been used in particularly mainstream ways, because actually it's got this big, you know, well, maybe not. Yeah. It's got this big, broad, accessible, open sounds, you know. So, right, so that's kind of my thing. So I've got a few minutes left. Can I play you a little bit of music? Yeah. So I alluded to a little bit of Debussy. We got a puppy last week, and by the end of the week we had to give back the puppy. So it was a very stressful week, and I got less practice on this than I wanted to, but I think it'll still be brilliant. So let's see how this goes. This is a very loose adaptation of The Girl with Flaxen Hair. All right. mic. Sorry.